The year is 1924, Mount Everest. Um, a peak so formidable it was dubbed the Third Pole. Two men set out to conquer it, and their story, the mystery of George Mallory and Sandy Irvine, has captivated the world ever since. We're about to embark on a deep dive into their expedition, sifting through eyewitness accounts, poring over expedition reports, even uncovering insights from newly digitized letters from Mallory himself.
Wow.
So what's the first thing that comes to mind for you when you think about this expedition?
Well, I think the historical context is really fascinating. World War I had just ended, and Britain, despite being on the winning side, was grappling with this sense of disillusionment, this yearning for something to boost national morale.
Right.
They'd missed out on the North and South Pole, so Everest, this unconquered giant, became their ultimate prize.
So it really allows us to step back in time and understand the weight of expectation placed upon these men's shoulders. They weren't just climbing for personal glory, they were carrying the hopes of a nation seeking a triumphant return to the world stage. So how did they even begin to prepare for such a daunting task using the technology available to them at the time?
Well, you have to remember that in 1924, climbing Everest was a completely different endeavor than it is today. We're talking rudimentary gear. Wool clothing, leather boots, a far cry from the high-tech materials we have now. Even their oxygen systems were basic, heavy cylinders that restricted their movement and provided limited breathable air.
Yeah, it's almost unimaginable today, isn't it? Setting off to climb the world's highest peak with such limited resources, it speaks volumes about their courage and their determination. But before we go any further, let's introduce our key players. We have George Mallory, a seasoned climber already, somewhat of a celebrity in the mountaineering world, driven by this almost philosophical desire to conquer Everest. His partner, Sandy Irvine, was a young, brilliant engineer, crucial to the mission for his work on improving their oxygen apparatus. And we can't forget Noel Odell, the geologist and climber who made the last confirmed sighting of the pair. His account has fueled much of the debate surrounding their disappearance. Right. So tell me, what do we know about this sighting?
Okay, so June 8th, 1924, Odell was making his way up the mountain when he spotted Mallory and Irvine high above. He described them as two tiny black ducks moving deliberately upward. The problem is the exact location of his sighting remains a point of contention even now, almost a century later.
And this is where the Everest mystery truly takes hold. Odell initially described seeing them on the last step but one from the summit pyramid. Some believe he meant the second step, an infamous near-vertical rock face that poses a significant challenge even to today's climbers. If they were already at the second step, it suggests they were making excellent progress, potentially on track to summit.
Yeah.
But hold on. If Odell's sighting was further down the mountain, say at the first or third step, it casts a different light on their progress. Could they realistically have summited and descended safely, given the time constraints and the limited daylight hours?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And unfortunately, the photographic evidence from the expedition doesn't provide any definitive answers. John Knoll, the expedition photographer, was a pioneer in his own right, hauling those bulky cameras up the slopes of Everest. But even his skills couldn't overcome the limitations of the technology at the time. The images we have are grainy, often lacking the detail needed to pinpoint locations with absolute certainty.
So we have this last sighting, shrouded in uncertainty, no clear photographic evidence, and then enter 1999, a pivotal year in this saga. A research expedition, led by climber Conrad Anker, made a discovery that sent shockwaves through the mountaineering community.
Right.
They found Mallory's body. Remarkably preserved by the extreme altitude and freezing temperatures, he was lying on a slope, his remains offering both answers and deeper mysteries.
Yeah.
I can only imagine the emotions that must have surged through those researchers. It was a poignant reminder of the mountain's unforgiving nature and the enduring power of this story. What did they find on Mallory that could help us understand what happened to him and Irvine?
Well, they found a number of artifacts, personal items,
Okay.
that bring his story into sharp focus. There was a pocket knife, an altimeter, even a tin of meat lozenges. Imagine needing a quick energy boost at 28,000 feet.
Right.
And perhaps, most significantly, they found an envelope containing what appear to be meticulously recorded oxygen pressure readings.
This detail speaks volumes, doesn't it? It suggests Mallory and Irvine were carefully monitoring their oxygen supply, acutely aware that their survival depended on making each precious breath count.
Right.
But what about the items that weren't found? No camera, for one, which, if recovered, could potentially rewrite mountaineering history. And even more telling, perhaps, was the missing photograph of Mallory's wife, Ruth. He'd promised to leave it at the summit if he reached it.
Yeah, yeah.
That missing photograph has become a powerful symbol in this whole saga. Did Mallory and Irvine reach the summit but succumb to the mountain during their descent, explaining the missing photo? Or did they meet their fate before ever reaching the top, the photo a silent testament to a goal left unreached? The 1999 discovery of Mallory's body, while monumental, did little to quell the debate.
Right.
What else did the positioning and condition of Mallory's remains tell us?
So his body was found roped to the mountain, indicating he and Irvine were still together at the time of a likely fall. The injuries were severe, a broken leg, fractured ribs suggesting a significant tumble. And remember those rudimentary oxygen systems they were using. The fact that Mallory's oxygen apparatus was discovered still attached, while Irvine's was found detached some distance away, suggests they took the time to try and untangle themselves, perhaps after a slip or a fall, before ultimately succumbing to their injuries in the elements.
That adds another layer of complexity to the story, doesn't it? It speaks to their resilience, their determination to survive, even in the face of unimaginable hardship.
But before we delve further into the arguments for and against their reaching the summit, there's another discovery we need to discuss, one that took place almost a century after Mallory and Irvine set out on their fateful expedition.
Okay.
In 2023, a National Geographic crew made a groundbreaking discovery while exploring the area around where Mallory's body had been found nearly 25 years earlier. A single boot. And not just any boot, it was Irvine's, identified by a name tag sewn into the sock.
What are the odds? To find a single boot after all this time, it's a testament to the meticulous work of these research teams and the enduring power of this mystery. But this discovery wasn't just symbolically significant, it provided tangible, though still inconclusive, clues about what may have happened to Mallory and Irvine.
Yeah.
For one, the boot, remarkably well preserved, was still laced up, with Irvine's foot still inside. The location of the discovery at a lower altitude on the central Rongbuk Glacier suggested that Irvine's remains, separated from Mallory's, were likely carried down the mountain over decades by the relentless forces of avalanches and glacial movement.
Right.
And this discovery has significant implications for how we interpret the events of 1924. For years, the prevailing theory was that if Mallory and Irvine had indeed reached the summit, they likely perished during their descent. The location of Irvine's boot, however, lends more credence to the theory that they met their fate during their ascent, swept away by the mountain's unforgiving nature. You can almost picture it, can't you? Those two figures dwarfed by the sheer scale of Everest, battling not only the altitude and the elements, but also the limitations of their time. The discovery of Irvine's boot is a stark reminder of the challenges they faced, reminding us to consider the historical context as we grapple with the enduring question: did they or didn't they reach the top?
It's a question that's fueled countless expeditions, books, documentaries, even an opera.
Right.
But let's return to the evidence, or rather the lack of conclusive proof, that lies at the heart of this mystery. What are the strongest arguments in favor of Mallory and Irvine having reached the summit?
Well, as we discussed earlier, there's Odell's sighting. If he truly saw them high on the mountain at the second step, and if they were making good time, and those are two significant ifs, they might have had just enough daylight to reach the summit and begin their descent before nightfall.
Yeah, but descending Everest in the dark, even for experienced climbers like Mallory and Irvine, with rudimentary equipment they had, would have been incredibly risky, wouldn't it?
Absolutely. Which brings us back to the mystery of the goggles found tucked away in Mallory's pocket. If he'd been descending in the darkness, wouldn't logic dictate he'd have had them on? This small detail continues to fuel speculation, suggesting they may have summited and encountered trouble during their return.
Right, right.
Of course, there are counter-arguments as well. Some experts maintain that even if they reached the second step by the time of Odell's sighting, the sheer physical challenge of summiting and descending with their equipment and limited oxygen would have been nearly insurmountable. And we can't ignore the missing photograph of Mallory's wife.
Mm-hmm.
As you mentioned earlier, it's become a symbolic piece of this puzzle. Some believe its absence from the summit means they never made it.
Right.
It's certainly a compelling argument. But what if we consider alternative explanations? Perhaps, in the face of exhaustion, deteriorating weather conditions, or even the early stages of oxygen deprivation, the act of leaving the photograph, as much as Mallory desired it, took a backseat to simply surviving the descent.
Yeah.
It's a reminder that we're dealing with a historical puzzle with missing pieces, and each new discovery, each new piece of evidence we unearth adds another layer of complexity. It's this very ambiguity that makes this story so enduring. But before we get lost in the what-ifs, let's not forget that this story isn't solely about two men and their ambition to conquer a mountain. It's a story deeply entwined with the political climate of the time, the quest for national pride, and the complex relationship between Western explorers and the indigenous communities who were often essential to their success.
It's easy to get caught up in the individual narratives, but the 1924 Everest expedition, like many of its kind, unfolded against a backdrop of complex geopolitical dynamics. Britain, still reeling from the aftermath of World War I, saw conquering Everest as a means of reasserting its global standing, of proving its mettle on the world stage.
And this ambition was deeply intertwined with the prevailing national sentiment of the time, a longing for heroes, for stories of courage and triumph in a world still grappling with the scars of war. Mallory and Irvine, whether intentionally or not, became symbols of that national pride, their quest embodying the spirit of adventure and resilience that resonated with the British public.
Right.
It's fascinating how these expeditions, often driven by a desire for conquest and national pride, relied so heavily on the expertise and resilience of the indigenous people. We touched briefly on the role of the Sherpa people earlier, but I think it's worth delving a bit deeper into their contributions, especially given how their role has been viewed and understood over time.
Absolutely.
The Sherpa people, with their generations of accumulated knowledge of the Himalayas, their understanding of the mountain's rhythms and its dangers, were indispensable to these early expeditions. They served as guides, porters, and often as lifelines for the Western climbers who dared to venture into this unforgiving terrain.
Right. And for too long, their contributions were minimized, relegated to the background while the focus remained on the achievements of the Western climbers who led the expeditions.
Right.
Thankfully, that perspective is shifting, and we're beginning to recognize and celebrate the Sherpa people for the skilled mountaineers they are, acknowledging their vital role in every aspect of these climbs.
It's a powerful reminder that exploration, even in its most extreme forms, is rarely a solitary pursuit. It's a collaborative endeavor that relies on the strengths and expertise of individuals from diverse backgrounds and cultures. We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive: the historical context, the key players, the evidence, and the enduring mystery. But before we wrap up, I find myself drawn back to the human element of this story. Who was George Mallory, the man behind the legend?
He's one of those figures shrouded in both history and myth, forever young and forever on that mountain. But when you delve into his letters, his writings, you encounter a complex and deeply human individual. Mallory was a school teacher, a husband, a father who grappled with the same anxieties and aspirations as anyone daring to chase a seemingly impossible dream.
He was already an accomplished climber before setting his sights on Everest, pushing the boundaries of what was considered possible in the Alps and the mountains of Wales. He wrote about the mountains with a sense of reverence, of deep respect for their power, but also with this infectious enthusiasm for the challenge, for the sheer joy of pushing his own limits.
And that comes through in his letters from the 1924 expedition, doesn't it? That sense of awe, of determination, even in the face of the immense risks they faced.
You can practically feel the weight of history pressing down on him in his words. One of his last letters to his wife, Ruth, he wrote about the beauty of the Himalayas, the camaraderie he shared with his fellow climbers, but also admitted that their chances of success were 50-1 against us.
Yeah.
Knowing what we know now, those words are particularly haunting. They serve as a poignant reminder that for all his ambition and drive, Mallory was acutely aware of the risks, of the very real possibility that he might not return from this expedition.
Right.
It wasn't just the inherent dangers of the mountain they had to contend with. The technological limitations of the time make their achievements all the more remarkable. Imagine for a moment navigating those treacherous slopes without the aid of GPS, relying on hand-drawn maps, compasses, and their own intuition to chart their course. Or trying to predict a sudden shift in weather, a life-threatening blizzard, with only a barometer and generations of accumulated local knowledge. The equipment they used is practically archaic by today's standards. Those heavy oxygen cylinders, while revolutionary for their time, restricted their movements, provided limited relief from the thin air, and required constant monitoring to ensure they wouldn't run out at a critical moment.
Yeah.
Each piece of equipment, each calculation, each decision they made carried life or death consequences. It boggles the mind to think of the sheer mental and physical fortitude it must have taken to face those challenges head-on.
Yeah, it really underscores how different their experience on Everest was compared to what climbers experience today. With advancements in technology, gear, weather forecasting, and communication, the mountain, while still immensely challenging, has become somewhat more manageable.
Which leads us right back to that central unresolved question. Did Mallory and Irvine reach the summit in 1924, nearly 3 decades before Hillary and Norgay? Despite the passage of a century, the discovery of bodies and artifacts, the analysis of photographs and maps, the answer remains elusive. We may never know for certain if they achieved their goal. Perhaps, somewhere on that icy windswept peak, buried beneath the snow and the weight of time, lies the answer, a camera containing the images that could rewrite history. Or perhaps the mountain will forever hold its secrets close, their story a testament to the enduring power of mystery and the human spirit's relentless pursuit of the unknown. Their story is a testament to the enduring allure of exploration, the power of human ambition, and the enduring mystery that still surrounds that majestic, unforgiving mountain.